not excusing him for his faults, because he has a lot of faults, and there's a lot of things that I disagree with him on. But I wouldn't be here at 24 years old, where everyone's told me, stay out of this, Frank, you're young, you have a bright future ahead of you, I'm already moving on, working on a lot of interesting projects, and I wouldn't be here if I thought that man was a pedophile.
They were the children who stood outside a courthouse in 2005, believing in a man the whole world had already convicted. They were the ones who called him family. They were the ones who defended him when no one else would. And 20 years later, they are the ones asking a different question. Not whether the world was wrong about Michael Jackson, but whether they were. This is the story of the Cascio siblings, and it does not begin in a courtroom. It begins in a childhood that for a long time looked like a fairy tale, before there was a lawsuit. Before there was a ruling, before a federal judge in California ever wrote the word horrific in a legal document, there was just a family, an ordinary Italian-American family from New Jersey, running a restaurant, living an ordinary life, until one extraordinary man walked into it and never fully left. His name was Frank Cascio, though most called him Frank Tyson, and his family ran a restaurant that Michael Jackson frequented in the late 1980s. What started as a regular customer became something else entirely, a friendship, then something closer to kinship. Michael began spending time with the Cascio children, Eddie, Dominic, Marie Nicole, Aldo, and their older brother Frank, who would go on to write books defending Jackson, who would stand by his side through allegations, through trials, through the slow public unraveling of a man the world once called the King of Pop. The Cascios did not just know Michael Jackson. They orbited him, they stayed at Neverland Ranch, they traveled with him. In interviews, in documentaries, and courtroom testimony, they called themselves his second family, a phrase that, at the time, sounded like devotion. Looking back now, some might call it something else, a euphemism. A door left slightly open. In 2005, when Michael Jackson stood trial on charges of child molestation, a trial that captivated and horrified the world in equal measure, it was the Cascio children who took the stand not against him, but for him. Frank Cascio testified in Jackson's defense. The family's loyalty was unwavering, public, and, to many, one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that the accusations against Jackson were fabrications. If this family that had spent years around him, alone with him, inside his private world, believed in his innocence, how bad could the truth really be? Jackson was acquitted on all counts that June, and for years the story seemed to end there. A complicated, controversial man, cleared by a jury, defended by the people who knew him best. But grief has a way of resurfacing in forms nobody expects. And in 2019, something happened that would not just reopen old wounds. It would, according to the Cascio siblings themselves, break something open inside them that had been sealed since childhood. That year, HBO released a documentary called Leaving Neverland. It told the stories of two other men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, who alleged, in graphic and devastating detail, that Michael Jackson had sexually abused them for years, beginning when they were as young as 7 years old. The documentary did not simply allege wrongdoing. It described, methodically, a pattern. The private world Jackson built around children, the secrecy, the isolation, the language of love used to describe something else entirely. Millions watched. The world recoiled. Radio stations pulled his music. Statues came down. And somewhere in New Jersey, 4 siblings who had spent their whole adult lives defending this man sat down, according to their later legal filings, and watched it too. What they say happened next is the part of this story that reads less like a legal filing and more like a psychological unraveling. In their own words, words that would later appear in a federal lawsuit, the siblings describe becoming deprogrammed. It is a jarring word to use about your own childhood. Deprogrammed implies there was a program to begin with. It implies someone built something inside your mind on purpose, and it takes work, real, painful work, to take it back out. According to the siblings, watching Robson and Safechuck describe patterns of grooming, secrecy, and psychological control triggered something. Memories they say they had buried, reframed, protected, began to surface differently. Not as evidence of a magical childhood spent with the most famous man on earth, but as something else, something they say they had been taught, for years, not to see clearly. It would take them more than 5 years to turn that private reckoning into a public legal claim. Grief like that does not move quickly. It has to be tested against a lifetime of built loyalty, against the version of the story you told the world, and yourself, for 2 decades. It has to survive family conversations that were, by all accounts, agonizing. It has to survive the fear of being disbelieved by the very public that once believed you when you defended him. But in February 2026, that reckoning became a filing. A 23-page federal lawsuit landed in a Los Angeles courtroom, and it did not read like anything the Cascio family had ever put their name to before. It alleged that Michael Jackson was, in the words of the complaint itself, a serial predator who drugged, assaulted, and abused each of them over the course of more than a decade, beginning, the suit claims, when some of them were only 7 or 8 years old. It accused him of transporting them, isolating them, and using his fame and his wealth as instruments of control. This was not an accusation from strangers. This was not another set of unfamiliar names added to a long and painful public record. This was the family. The ones who sat in that courtroom in 2005. The ones whose faith in him had once helped set him free. And that is where the story could have simply become another chapter in the long, contested history of Michael Jackson's legacy. One more allegation in a public reckoning that is never fully resolved. Except this time, the case would not be decided by what the siblings said happened to them as children. It would be decided by a piece of paper they signed as adults. Because in 2019, the very same year Leaving Neverland aired, the very same year the siblings say their reckoning began, something else happened behind closed doors. A settlement, a private, confidential agreement between the Cascio family and the Michael Jackson estate. The public would not learn the details of that settlement for years, but its consequences would outlast almost everything else in this story. Settlements like these are strange documents. They are written in the language of resolution, but they often function as instruments of silence. Buried within the legal architecture of that 2019 agreement was a clause, an arbitration clause, stating that any future disputes between the Cascio family and the Jackson estate would not be settled in a public courtroom. They would be settled privately, behind closed doors, away from cameras, away from journalists, away from the public that had once watched this family stand so visibly, so vocally, in Michael Jackson's defense. At the time it was signed, this clause was likely just boilerplate to most people involved, a standard piece of legal language nobody expected to matter. But contracts do not care about the emotional journeys of the people who sign them. They do not know that a person might change. They do not account for the possibility that someone could sign their name in one state of mind and, years later, in a completely different one, try to use the courts for something entirely unforeseen, to tell the world what they now believe truly happened to them as children. When the Cascio siblings filed their trafficking lawsuit in February 2026, the Jackson estate's response was swift, and it was not gentle. Their attorneys did not primarily argue about what did or did not happen decades ago at Neverland Ranch. They argued something colder, something almost procedural, that this lawsuit was, in their words, a transparent forum shopping tactic. A scheme, they alleged, to extract hundreds of millions of dollars from Michael Jackson's estate and companies. Where the siblings framed their filing as a rupture, a long-delayed truth, the estate framed it as a strategy, a financial maneuver dressed in the language of trauma. It is worth sitting with that collision for a moment. Two totally incompatible stories about the same 4 human beings. In one telling, they are survivors who spent years working up the courage to speak. In the other, they are opportunists, exploiting a dead man's name for money. The courtroom does not exist to resolve which of those stories is emotionally true. It exists only to determine which one is legally permitted to be heard in public, and that is a very different question. Before this case ever reached a verdict, there was another courtroom moment, quieter than the lawsuit itself, but just as revealing. In January, a month before the trafficking suit was even filed, the siblings had already appeared in a Beverly Hills courthouse for a related matter, an attempt to void that 2019 settlement entirely. They argued it was not simply a contract. They called it, in their own words, an unlawful agreement to silence victims of childhood sexual abuse. It was an attempt to strip the arbitration clause of its power before it could be used against them. That attempt did not succeed. The court, even then, signaled that the settlement would hold. And so when the trafficking lawsuit itself finally reached a judge, Judge Hernan D. Vera, presiding in federal court in Los Angeles, the central question was never really going to be about Neverland Ranch, or private planes, or what 4 children may or may not have experienced inside a world built entirely around one famous man's desires. The central question was about a signature. About whether 4 adults, years after the fact, could undo what they had agreed to as a condition of resolving their dispute the first time. On August 12, 2026, Judge Vera delivered his ruling, and it is worth hearing his words exactly as he wrote them, because they capture something almost unbearably honest about how the American legal system is built. He acknowledged the horror of what was alleged. He did not dismiss it, soften it, or explain it away. He simply wrote that the court was without discretion to do anything but enforce the language of the arbitration clause. Horrific, and yet, legally, irrelevant to the outcome. Read that sentence again. A federal judge looked directly at allegations of drugging, of assault, of trafficking against children as young as 7 or 8, and said, "This may all be true, and it does not matter, because of a contract signed in 2019. The law, in that moment, was not adjudicating truth. It was adjudicating jurisdiction. The case was ordered into confidential arbitration, not dismissed in the sense of being disproven, redirected, moved behind a door that the public will likely never be allowed to open. Whatever evidence exists, whatever testimony might have been given, whatever cross-examinations might have unfolded in a public trial, all of it will now happen in a room without cameras, without a jury of ordinary citizens, without the kind of public reckoning that Leaving Neverland itself once provided for Robson and Safechuck. There is a strange, almost cruel symmetry here. It was a documentary, a public, unfiltered, camera-driven confrontation with the past, that the Cascio siblings say cracked open their own memories in 2019, and it is precisely that kind of public confrontation that the legal system has now closed off to them. The very mechanism that allowed the world to hear Robson and Safechuck's stories in raw, unfiltered detail will not be available here. Arbitration is private by design. Whatever the truth is, it will most likely stay locked in a room that history cannot access. To understand why this matters beyond one family, you have to zoom out. The Cascio case is not happening in isolation. It arrived 7 years after Wade Robson and James Safechuck's own lawsuits against Jackson-owned corporations were revived by a California appeals court, only to be dismissed again, years later, after courts ruled the corporations bore no legal duty to protect them from Jackson himself, a distinction that let the estate avoid liability not by disproving abuse, but by narrowing exactly whose responsibility it was. Robson's case ended the same way so many of these cases end, not with a verdict on the truth of what he described, but with a technical finding about corporate structure. Jackson had complete ownership of those companies, the judge wrote. There was no separation to exploit, no negligent third party to blame, only a single towering figure who controlled everything, and who is no longer alive to answer for any of it. This is the peculiar shape of Michael Jackson's afterlife. He died in 2009, but he has been on trial, in one form or another, almost every year since. Streaming numbers climb. His song Rock With You recently crossed 1 billion streams, a staggering testament to how thoroughly his music has survived every allegation thrown at the man himself. Tribute nights fill venues. Documentaries about his life continue to be produced, dissected, debated. And at the very same time, in courtrooms most people never hear about, his estate keeps fighting the same battle over and over. Not about whether the public should still listen to his music, but about whether the darkest claims about how he lived his private life will ever be tested in the open. It is possible to hold both of these realities at once, and that is precisely what makes this story so uncomfortable. A billion streams do not erase an allegation. An allegation does not erase a billion streams. The culture has simply learned to hold him in two separate rooms, the music in one, unexamined and thriving, and the accusations in another, litigated endlessly, resolved almost never. For the Cascio siblings, this ruling is not an ending. Their attorneys have signaled they intend to pursue the case through arbitration, which means, in practical terms, that this story does not stop being told. It simply stops being told to us. Whatever unfolds next, whatever testimony is given, whatever evidence is weighed, will happen in a room the public will likely never enter, decided by an arbitrator instead of a jury, governed by rules the four siblings agreed to years before they ever imagined needing to challenge them. There is something quietly devastating in that. As children, the Cascios lived inside Michael Jackson's private world, a world built specifically to be inaccessible to outsiders. No cameras, no scrutiny, no witnesses beyond the ones he chose. And now, as adults, seeking what they call justice for what happened inside that world, they find themselves once again inside a room without cameras. Once again governed by rules they did not fully choose. Once again, the public locked outside, left to wonder. Maybe that is the real inheritance of proximity to power like his. Not fame, not fortune, not the stories you get to tell at dinner parties about the year you spent inside Neverland Ranch. But this, a lifetime spent behind closed doors, one way or another, never quite able to choose when those doors open and when they close again. Whatever the truth of what happened to Edward, Dominic, Marie-Nicole, and Aldo Cascio, one thing is certain. It will not be decided by the people who have spent 2 decades debating Michael Jackson's legacy from the outside. It will be decided quietly, privately, by people none of us will ever see, in a room none of us will ever enter, and when it is over, we may never know what was said, what was proven, or what was simply allowed to disappear. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of fame this large. Not that the world remembers everything, but that some things, the smallest rooms, the quietest conversations, the truths held closest to the people who lived them, are never meant to be remembered by anyone but the people who were there.